So the Tchaikovskyan influence that appears particularly in his later works. We'll listen to the Andante from his third concerto. It's going to be at 122 in. So those triplets in the horn sound Tchaikovskyan to me, as does this grazioso idea, the eighth notes coming up to an appoggiatura, like what you'd find in a waltz movement by Tchaikovsky. Chopin influence. Davidov arranged pieces by Chopin, and both in his use of melodic chromaticism and some of his florid ornamentations, there's a Chopin-like feel. So techniques that he likes, which it gets pointed out that he likes three-string chords a lot. So we had in the cadenza of the first movement, there's an octave frame with motion below it, and then actually a thumb position extension in there. His third concerto is good for teaching these octave frame patterns, which are very fundamental and show up in etudes on thumb position. And in the first concerto, we have a good passage. I like this passage actually because it forces you to think about your non-playing fingers. When I have thumb down, I'm not going to have the fourth finger down. I'll play it and then explain a little more. So if I have both my thumb and fourth finger down, my hand's going to get very tense, but I'm using the second finger as a fulcrum. So when I play those, my thumb is still on the string, but it's not pressing it all the way down. And the passage itself sort of makes you realize that, because the first tier of this sequence, the thumb is in a harmonic and not pressing the string all the way down. And it's a lot easier than the other tiers at first, and then you wonder why and realize that. So in the Dvorak Concerto, a Davidov student, Hanush Vihan, cello professor at the Prague Conservatory, contributed some passage work that's actually a lot like what I just played. The same idea of three-string triads with the thumb and then higher fingers, and then fourth finger use. So apparently Prokofiev didn't much like the music, but Rostropovich gave him works by Davidov and Popper when Prokofiev recruited him to help with the reworking of the Opus 58 cello concerto into the Symphonia Concertante. And maybe Prokofiev took some hints from Davidov about how to write for the cello. So here's the third movement of Davidov's fourth concerto. That's one part of it, and then at another point we have. And here we see, it's actually a characteristic feature of Prokofiev's string writing in general, but at the end of the Symphonia Concertante, so similar ideas. Garbasova gave the works played one of the concertos for Samuel Barber during his composition of his own cello concerto. So what stuck out to me was in the cadenza of the Barber concerto. There he's playing around with tritone on the G and D strings, an octave above that, and then a neighbor note dissonance. And in the first movement of Davidov's fourth concerto, we have some similar writing. Wasn't terribly in tune, but we have a tritone, an octave, and then not a seventh, but a ninth. So in the works where there seems to be a connection to Davidov concertos, we see this sort of three-string difficulty showing up. And Davidov wasn't the only cellist to write using motion below an octave. And similar configurations, we see that kind of writing, for instance, in works by Francois Servet, a great Belgian cellist, of basically one or half a generation before Davidov. So self-accompaniment also used in the Dvorak concerto in the last movement. Similar to the cadenza. And the Davidov hinge. These pieces were apparently popular in the repertoire of cellists during Davidov's lifetime and for some decades after. So you can speculate about whether composers, they would have been on the radar of composers when they were checking out how to write for the cello. But in the Kodaly Sonata, we have in the third movement hinge-wise actually a perfect fifth between thumb and one, going back to a half step back, which is again like what we saw at the end of the first movement of the same sort of writing. So, to recap, Davidov during his lifetime was an eminent, highly respected performer, a consequential teacher. His pedagogical lineage and ideas about technique are still with us to this day, and he wrote a body of music that we can explore and possibly add to our repertoire both as performers and to our teaching libraries. And if we use these works to supplement works such as the Haydn C Major Concerto, the Saint-Saëns Concerto, the Lalo Concerto, we'll have more options in our studio classes. We'll have works that require students to possibly think for themselves more than something they could just listen to a recording for. And we have a wide variety of techniques that get used in these pieces that are applicable to the broader repertoire. It's a different sort of playing a concerto versus an etude. In an etude, you can take time in a lot of different places. It's usually just played as an encore. But if you play with an orchestra one of these concertos, you're getting a different intensity of communication. Communication with the conductor, communication with the group. It's a different cognitive and physical situation. This concludes my lecture. Thank you all for tuning in.